that you bless us even this morning and restore our health and bring us out to fellowship and study your word. And we pray that you would now be with us during the Sunday school hour as well as worship, that you would direct our minds and hearts towards you and grow us in Christ-likeness and in love for your word and your work throughout the history of your church. And so we ask these things in the name of Christ our Savior. Amen. All right, the children are dismissed. This will take us into really the liberalism of the 20th century. And South Carolina plays an important role, including Columbia Seminary. But yeah, basically we covered a little bit last week about George Whitefield came to Charleston, South Carolina. You had Huguenots, they were fleeing France, French Protestants. So they came in Charleston 1687. We mentioned the Independent Church. And that's independent churches in Savannah. And then you had the Midway Church as well in Georgia, Liberty County, Georgia. So you had some churches that are still there today. Midway split, I think went into 4 different churches, but you do have a Midway Presbyterian church today. But very important early churches. And then we mentioned Archibald Stobo, who actually was the founder of the first presbytery in the South, and it was sometime before 1728, but he that presbytery did not survive, so that's part of the reason. In one sense, it was the first presbytery in the South, but in another sense, it's not because it didn't continue. So that's why generally people will say the Hanover Presbytery, which was established by Samuel Davies, was the first presbytery in the South, because that one continued. It was important. Okay, so, so this is Independent Pres Savannah, so this must have been the one in Charleston. Again, we note that it's somewhat odd to have an independent, when it's Presbyterian in particular, it's odd to be independent Presbyterian. But if you have independent churches, they're generally congregational. That makes sense. That's what they are, polity-wise. Okay, so I did mention maybe a little bit of this last week. Let me mention Presbyterians in North Carolina and Georgia. So we tend to focus on South Carolina, but I want to give a little bit of attention to these other colonies. Actually, I did mention some of this where you had Francis McKemie. Remember, he's the father of American Presbyterianism. He did come to North Carolina some in 1683 and 84. And then I mentioned, I thought it was John Thompson. I'm not finding that. Okay, so Francis McKemie in North Carolina. Then Georgia, you did have some Presbyterians. You have more Presbyterians in North Carolina, but you did have some in Georgia. Some of the Scots came over there, and so that's even the origin of independent pres in Savannah. So Savannah, Georgia. So coastal Georgia there. But at the end of the day, Presbyterianism did not prosper in Georgia or we could say the coastal Carolinas. Even with Charleston there, as I'll note in a moment, Presbyterianism grew much more in the back country. So it's not as prominent along the coast, so you have some important churches there. And part of the challenge here was Anglicanism. So the Anglican Church, I mean, this is the case for several states, but the Anglican Church was the established church of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So now I'll note the other Anglican establishments. Virginia. So Virginia had some of these same challenges. You had dissenters, but it was strongly Anglican early on. Maryland was Anglican, and then partially New York. And I don't know their history that well, but you had a lot of Dutch that came there too. It was initially New Amsterdam. Okay, so with the American War for Independence, you actually have an end to the Anglican Church's establishment in the Carolina Low Country, and this makes sense, right? I mean, you had the war, and so I mentioned this before. The Anglican Church had to essentially rebrand. Because they had ties with the King of England. Well, that doesn't work well in America after the war's over, and so they changed their name to the Protestant Episcopal Church. But really, Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, whatever you want to call it, just declined after that, right? It just didn't survive long because and we still have some today, but it was heavily tied with England, and America established its independence. So that was weak in the Anglican Church. But even with this, like in the Low Country, the Presbytery of Charleston still managed to seize its existence around this time. So even with the end of Anglicanism, you still had challenges with Presbyterianism. You did have a successor presbytery there, the Presbytery of Charleston, in 1790, but it also ceased by 1829, and it never joined the General Assembly. So really, you just had challenges in the Carolinas, especially on the coast there. Presbyterianism just didn't take off as much. You did have some things. This one is kind of interesting. Several Reformed congregations in the Low Country formed the Congregational Association of, so this is South Carolina, in 1801. And so you had Congregationalism there. We mentioned that. You see that with some of the independent churches. And they made a proposal, this Congregational Association of South Carolina, to Harmony Presbytery that led to the formation of what was called the Charleston Union Presbytery. And the reason it was called a Union Presbytery is because it was a union between the Congregationalists and Presbyterians. And just as a reminder, you also had this plan of union in the Presbyterian Church as a whole, and that was 1801, between the Presbyterian Church and the Congregationalists. And so that was the plan of union, and that eventually led to the Old School, New School split in 1837 and 38. So this is just interesting. You have this Charleston Union Presbytery, which is composed of both Presbyterians and Congregational churches, and it actually affiliated with the Presbyterian Church in 1823, but then divided in 1839, which that kind of makes sense because that was after the Old School, New School split. So I don't know the full history there, but it's just interesting that you're seeing Presbyterians and Congregationalists work together. Of course, if they're working, if that presbytery is entirely Presbyterian, then that would actually just make all the Congregationalists Presbyterian. But so it must not have been entirely. It must have been a little looser. Okay, so I want to talk though about Presbyterianism in the back country. Okay, because this is important. Now, I don't know if this is a term that's used as much today, so let me define it. I don't know if you've ever, I've mentioned this book before, called Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher. It was 1989. The subtitle is 4 British Folkways in America. It's a really excellent book. It's a famous book in American history because he traces 4 different groups that came from Britain to America. And it really does help explain kind of the background to America. So he mentions the Quakers, and they go into like Pennsylvania area. And then he mentions you have like the New England Puritans. You have the Cavaliers, which that would be like the Anglicans. They go into Virginia and even parts of South Carolina. But then you have the Scots and Scots-Irish, and they go into the back country. And so these guys are mostly Presbyterian. And this is just an important part of American history. So here's how he defines the backcountry. He says, the southern backcountry was a vast area roughly the size of Western Europe, so that's large, extending 800 miles south from Pennsylvania to Georgia and several hundred miles west from the Piedmont Plateau to the banks of the Mississippi. And so this region, we could say, would include southwestern Pennsylvania, western Maryland, western Virginia, and then North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So it's a huge area. But this is where the Scots-Irish often went, and this is where Presbyterianism really flourished, because that's where the Scots went, or Scots-Irish. I mentioned this before, but just to explain. So Scots-Irish, they tended to be Scottish. They went to Ulster, North Ireland, and they were there for a while and then came to the U.S., the colonies. So they were as far as we know, they were mostly Scots. They might have had some Irish mixed in there, but they call them the Scots-Irish. Okay, so this area is important. So that's where we're going to talk about it a little bit, especially as it relates to the Carolinas. William Robinson is the first known Presbyterian minister to go to the back country in 1742, and this is where I was thinking of John Thompson. He went 1751. He visited settlements in Iredell County, North Carolina. Now Thompson, I mentioned him a while back. He was the guy that was really behind the Adopting Act of 1729. So just as a little review, the Adopting Act was where the Presbyterian Church officially adopted the Westminster Standards. You had the first presbytery there in 1706, and they actually didn't adopt the Westminster Confession initially. So that was a debate that went on, and it wasn't until 1729 that you had that Adopting Act. And so that was very important. Thompson was a major player there. He was an advocate of adopting the Westminster Standards. And yes, there were some Presbyterians who did not want to adopt it. They either had a looser view of subscription, or they just maybe had theological qualms, and so they didn't want to adopt it formally. You also had a man named Hugh McAden, a graduate of the College of New Jersey, so that's Princeton, where John Witherspoon taught. He was licensed by the Newcastle Presbyterian in 1755 and sent to the Carolinas. And then you actually have another you have a presbytery formed in this region in 1770. This was 7 ministers in North Carolina. And so this is the second presbytery in the South. It's called the Presbytery of Orange in 1770. So you had the Hanover Presbytery is the first presbytery in the South that survives, established by Samuel Davies, and that's mostly Virginia, although initially it was bigger. So I should note this. The Presbytery of Hanover initially was like the whole South, and then once you have this form, the Presbytery of Orange in 1770, this consists of the territory east of the Blue Ridge Mountains and then south of Virginia, and so it essentially divides the Hanover Presbytery. So you have 2 presbyteries for this period. And this is still colonial America. So you have two presbyteries. And then you have the Presbytery of South Carolina is created in 1785. So you have continued growth in these amongst Presbyterians in this region, and so you have more presbyteries and then more synods and etc. Things continue to grow. Okay, so this is interesting. The backcountry. What was it like, religiously at least? Well, it was many in the backcountry were nominally Presbyterian, and that's because they came from Scotland or they were Scots-Irish. But many were not religious or morally upright. So I'm going to mention a guy here. Now, this guy's not Presbyterian. His name is Charles Woodmason. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy before. He was an Anglican missionary. He's interesting, and you can go read his stuff on the backcountry. He was an Anglican missionary to the backcountry. He was born around 1720, died 1789. And so the reason Woodmason's interesting is he journaled on all of these things. So he described all the people he was meeting and his ministry. And so that's just really fascinating stuff. Some of this stuff may be even slightly humorous, as I'll mention. He apparently didn't like a lot of the people he met, or at least wasn't impressed by them, because he has some critical things to say. Now, I think this is pretty bad, just to show you kind of the immorality, you could say, or just these people in the backcountry. He estimated that 94%, of the young women for which he conducted a wedding, so he would marry them, but that 94% were already pregnant by the time they got married. So this is just standard fare. And then he even said that 9 out of 10 settlers had a venereal disease. So obviously a lot of immorality taking place. Woodmason referred to the manners of the North Carolina backcountry in particular. He said that their manners were vile and corrupt, And then he goes on, he says, the whole country is a stage of debauchery, dissoluteness, and corruption. All right, so he's not a big fan. He attributed this to the fact that the region was composed of, here's what he said, quote, outcasts of all the other colonies who take refuge there. So they're just outcasts, was his take. So he spoke very negatively, and yet he also noted there were some devout Christians there, and there were many Scots-Irish families that owned things like they would own Westminster Shorter Catechism, Watts hymns, even, of course, the Bible, but also Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. So some of these, obviously these people had some background, Christian background. I thought this was interesting in his journal. Woodmason, this is 1765, he noted that basically Presbyterians and Baptists wouldn't marry. I mean, this is they're kids to each other. So this is pretty interesting. Remember, you had Anglicans, but you also had Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterians, and the Methodists and Baptists grew around this period and eventually became the majority. Presbyterians were never the majority in most of these places. So here's what he said, though. He said, quote, a Presbyterian would sooner marry 10 of his children to members of the Church of England than one to a Baptist. The same from the Baptists as to the Presbyterians. Their rancor is surprising. So I just find that interesting. The Presbyterians at the time were more willing to marry, at least according to his records, and I think this makes sense from what I've seen, that they were more willing to marry their children to Anglicans. So that meant they thought more highly of Anglicanism than Baptist. But this makes sense because of theology. Hold on, this just makes sense because the Anglicans had the 39 Articles. Some of them might have been actually somewhat reformed, and the Baptists. Some of the Baptists were early on were Calvinistic, but they didn't baptize their infants, so there was obviously a major issue with the covenant there. So go ahead. Yeah, he was Anglican. Yeah, Woodmason was Anglican. Yeah, he's an Anglican missionary to the Presbyterians. Yeah, but he's just saying this is what the Presbyterians did, is they would marry the Anglicans, but they didn't marry the Baptists. But he didn't necessarily like the Presbyterians himself. I mean, so I don't think he was making this up or anything. But actually, the reason this kind of fits, though, is the Presbyterians were up there with the Anglicans as far as their education. They were the elites, but the Anglicans had most of the power. But the Presbyterians established a lot of educational institutions, and they even got involved in government. Baptists and Methodists, I mentioned this before, but this is just a common theme, is with early America, they didn't insist on an education most of the time, and so they had uneducated ministry. So I think all of that ties into the fact that the Presbyterians just found themselves to be closer to the Anglicans theologically than the Baptists and Methodists. Yeah.
Do you think the high death rate of children made a difference with having covenant baptisms?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Because you're right. I mean, you would have kids die all the time. I mean, people, I don't know what the death rate was, but it was fairly common to lose maybe up to half your children, right? Yeah, I guess that could maybe tie in is we don't want to wait until the kid professes faith to give them the sign of the covenant because they often die in infancy or die in as a youth. So that might tie in. That would even, I think, emphasize even more how important infant baptism is. But I don't know if I haven't seen anything explained on that, but that would make sense, yeah. And so the Anglicans were with them there. Now, the Methodists, they do infant baptism because they came out of Anglicanism, but that's a whole interesting thing because the Methodists and Baptists are kind of similar, but Methodists have bishops and things like that. Okay. So backcountries, I think it's pretty interesting to consider the backcountry. Let me mention a little more there. The Synod of New York and the Synod of Philadelphia, so these were more established synods in the north. They were sending missionaries into the backcountry, and many of them were influenced by George Whitefield. So we mentioned Whitefield. He was himself an Anglican, though a founder of Methodism when they eventually broke off. So Whitefield kind of like more New Side, he would be close to the New Side Presbyterians. So these were New Side Presbyterians that were coming from the north, and they were aggressive in their missionary work. And so this would include men like, I've mentioned some of these, it's been a while, but John Blair, Samuel Finley, Gilbert Tennant, William Tennant. So you have the Tennants. Remember, Gilbert and William Tennant, their father, William, also William Tennant Sr., he started the Log College there in New Jersey. So it was kind of a precursor to even the College of New Jersey, Princeton. So you had a lot of these New Side ministers, New Side Presbyterians that were coming into the back country. Now, I mean, just think of this. We can compare, like, okay, early America, we see a lot of these people, had Christian background, but they might have been living, immorally, or they just, weren't very religious, whatnot. But just think of the fact that they're coming from Scotland. A lot of them have Bibles. They have this religious background. I think that missionary work was just a lot easier. It was much more, ripe for conversions and the like, compared to, if people have no religious background, right? So I think that's just important to take into account, as these men were coming into, these New Side Presbyterian preachers were coming into, essentially Presbyterian backcountry. But there was no competition from missionaries in other churches in this area until closer to the American War for Independence, when more Baptists and Methodists came on the scene. And then Baptists eventually drove, they came to dominate. I mean, I mentioned that before. And that's during the Second Great Awakening, so that's like 1790 to 1840. So that's really after the American War for Independence. But the war hindered Presbyterian development in Georgia. But then the South Carolina Presbytery, which started in 1785, they resumed missionary efforts in Georgia. So you had people actually coming from the north, but you also had, in Georgia at least, you had people coming from South Carolina. And South Carolina grew a fair amount itself. Their presbytery was even divided in 1802 because they were growing significantly. They reunited a little bit later. You do have a synod formed in the Carolinas in 1788. This is the Synod of the Carolinas, 1788. And so this had Abingdon, Orange, and South Carolina presbyteries. They later add Old Charleston Presbytery. Then that synod, the Synod of Carolinas, then divides in 1813 to form the Synod of North Carolina and the Synod of South Carolina and Georgia. So the South Carolina and Georgia Synod was together. So that just kind of displays the growth of the church there, is you have, when you have presbyteries dividing and synods dividing, that's a good sign that just everything was growing. In 1845, the Synod of South Carolina and Georgia was divided into the Synod of South Carolina and then a separate Synod of Georgia. And then I'll mention Florida, because I'm not going to talk much about them, but there was a Presbytery of Florida, and that divided from the Presbytery of Georgia in 1841. So that was a little slower growth there, but you did have a separate Presbytery of Florida. So I'll just note that. Okay, so the backcountry, I mean, obviously things went fairly well. I mean, Charles Woodmason, in the mid-1700s, had a lot of negative comments about the Scots-Irish there, but he was ministering to them. But then you had more, like I said, more New Side Presbyterians coming in, and things just grew. You had a lot of conversions and growth of churches and the like. Okay, I'm going to transition to mentioning some of the, we'll talk Christian institutions, just to show how Christian everything got. Any thoughts or questions on any of that so far? Okay, so Presbyterianism prospered mostly in the backcountry in these states. But these lower South states, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, they, even apart from Presbyterianism, they were fairly Christian. So I want to kind of explain how this was the case, or why this was the case. North Carolina, we'll talk about North Carolina first. North Carolina became a Protestant state with a large number, they had a large number of Presbyterians. So just to be clear, because a lot of times people debate the American history, but this is very clear with a lot of the states. They were very Christian, and we'll see this even with the civil government of North Carolina and the others. So North Carolina's, they had a 1776 Constitution. They disestablished the church. So they they prohibited the establishment of any one religious church or denomination. So this happened in a lot of places at that time, and continued to happen more and more. I mean, eventually all of the states, disestablished. So this is an important point. I mentioned this before. Disestablishment does not equal non-religious government. Okay, that's an important point. Just because they don't have an official state church doesn't mean it's not a Christian state in any sense. In fact, North Carolina required its civil officers to be Orthodox Protestants. This is very clear. Article 32 of their 1776 Constitution. This forbade civil officers from denying, quote, the being of God or the truth of the Protestant religion. So not just denying God. Obviously they're banning atheists from holding office, but they're actually saying you have to hold the truth of the Protestant religion. So this is even saying Roman Catholics couldn't be civil officers. They can't be governor or serve in the assembly, the legislature and whatnot. Now, let me qualify it to say this, though. A place like North Carolina, it's so heavily Protestant, you didn't really have to enforce this that much at the time. So when it comes to the question of enforcement, there's not much evidence that this religious test was enforced. And we even know there was a lawyer, William Gaston, who he held both state and federal office between 1800 and 1843, and he was Roman Catholic. So you had some Roman Catholics. So obviously they didn't enforce this. Now, what's interesting is Gaston argued against the religious test, right, requiring that you hold the Protestant faith. He was unsuccessful, but the North Carolina did eventually substitute. Instead of requiring the truth of the Protestant religion, they changed it to the Christian religion. So that shows you they still knew the law, and they still were, wanted it at least known, if not strictly enforced. And then this is interesting. The North Carolina Constitution was amended in 1868 and 1876. So this is after the Civil War, to allow any believer in God to hold office. But here's the key. You still have to believe in God. So they still at that point excluded atheists from holding office in civil government. So I think that's pretty important, because that's quite late. That's let's do some math. That's 150 years ago that they were saying atheists can't hold office in the state of North Carolina. Okay. I just think most people aren't familiar with this information, and that's why they can deny. It's easy for some people to deny that America was ever Christian or something like that. It's like, no, actually they were very much Christian. Okay, North Carolina's ratification convention. So they're considering, this is August 1788. North Carolina is considering the Constitution. They had the Articles of Confederation in place after the War for Independence, but were the states going to adopt this new Constitution? Which, of course, they did, but there was debate. And actually, North Carolina was one of, I think they were only one of two states that voted against ratifying the Constitution. They joined Rhode Island. So initially, North Carolina says, no, we're not going to adopt the Constitution. Now, I think you needed 9 out of 13 for it to go into effect, which would have been, who knows what would have happened if it didn't play out as it is. It could have been complicated. But it's not until November of 1789 that North Carolina holds another state convention, and this time they do ratify the Constitution. But we should know they propose amendments, and so do other states, that eventually lead to what's called the Bill of Rights, which is ratified in 1791, so two years after So you have the Constitution ratified, and then 2 years later, they have the Bill of Rights ratified. So that would include the First Amendment, first 10 amendments. So that includes this ban. So this is interesting to think about. People like to cite the First Amendment, but you had 2 years there where you actually had the Constitution in effect, but they did not have the First Amendment, where it says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. So, but the reason they wanted that was at the federal level. It wasn't a state issue. So the reason I mention this is this gets very interesting. So as part of this, this was in 1788 when North Carolina rejected the Constitution initially. They were discussing the Constitution's impact on state religious freedom. And so they're debating actually the religious test clause, because at the U.S. Constitution forbade a religious test but it really was strictly applying to federal office. So it would have allowed state officers to still, the state of North Carolina could still have its restrictions on who can hold state office regarding religion. So there was a man named Henry Abbott. He expressed concern over the religious test clause, and here's his reason. He says, quote, "If there be no religious test required, pagans, deists, and Mahometans," that's Muslims, might obtain offices among us, and that the senators and representatives might all be pagans. So they're just, part of the reason they want religious tests is they're concerned there's going to be non-Christians holding office. Responding to such concerns, there was a man named James Iredell, and he actually goes on to be he was an important Supreme Court justice early on, 1790 to 1799. So he's a big name. He actually supported ratification of the Constitution, and he argued that the clause was only a restriction on Congress. So he says, we can still have our state tests. This is fine. It's not a big deal. Here's what he says. He says, quote, people don't say this today, but think about this. Iredell, quote, "If any future Congress should pass an act concerning the religion of the country, it would be an act which they are not authorized to pass by the Constitution, and which the people would not obey. Everyone would ask, who authorized the government to pass such an act? It is not warranted by the Constitution and is barefaced usurpation." So he's saying the federal government can't actually pass anything related to restricting the states. That's his concern. He's saying the federal government can't tell us states what to do with religion. We reserve the right to do what we want. That's his point. And he says if they did that, we wouldn't obey. Now the problem is the federal government does do that stuff, and we obey it. So just note, we don't think the same way that they did. David Caldwell, he was a Presbyterian minister, and he was at this ratification convention. He was an important guy. I'll write him up here, because David Caldwell. And his dates are 1725 to 1824. So he's a Presbyterian pastor. He also founded an academy in Greensboro, so he was just influential. I'll maybe mention him again later. So this is interesting. He expressed concern about this religious test clause in the federal Constitution. He says that it would be, quote, "an invitation for Jews and pagans of every kind to come among us," and then he says, that's end quote, "which in the future would, quote, might endanger the character of the United States." So this is a minister at the convention, and he's saying that the concern is if we allow Jews and pagans to come into the U.S., that would endanger the character of the United States. So this is just how they spoke back then. They just had concerns of America no longer being a Protestant country. And so, this is where immigration does play a huge role. You have in the 1800s mass Catholic immigration, and then later on, it gets blown open, where that's really what watered down the Protestantism of America was immigration. Let me note this. I think this is interesting. I mentioned that Henry Abbott, he said that he noted when I was reading this, he said that he believed that in North Carolina, quote, "a majority of the community are Presbyterians." So he's saying this in 1788. He's saying the majority of the state is Presbyterian. So I think that's noteworthy. Okay, so that's North Carolina. You get a sense, obviously it's a fairly Christian state. Let me see, I had, Georgia. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Georgia. So Georgia, they disestablished the Anglican Church as well, but they still enacted Christian laws. Georgia, a little bit about Georgia. I didn't mention this before. Georgia was initially settled in the 1720s as a haven for English debtors, but it ended up attracting a lot of religious dissenters, so essentially non-Anglicans, because of the guarantees of the free exercise of religion in the colony's 1732 charter. Now, let me mention there's one exception: religious liberty for, or what was the language I used? Free exercise of religion, except for Roman Catholics. Okay, so so major exception. It's Protestant. But so this is the colony's 1732 charter. And so Georgia, since its founding, was really it really displayed religious tolerance, and so that's how the colony was understood. The Church of England did gain greater favoritism there in 1752 because the colony's trustees surrendered interest to the king due to financial pressure. So you had kind of a shift in power there. But even when the Church of England was established in Georgia in 1758, it really was a softer establishment compared to Virginia and compared to South Carolina. And this just plays a role, in the future of Georgia. In fact, dissenters were so strong there that by 1773, and this shows that it's a soft establishment, by 1773, as much as 1/3 of the Georgia legislature was made up of dissenters. So 1/3, that's a lot. Records even indicate that some dissenters were elected as church wardens and vestrymen. So they're even, filling what are supposed to be places of the Anglican clergy. Georgia enacted Sabbath laws in 1762. This is also very common that states would have Sabbath laws. And so that wasn't limited to Presbyterians. A lot of Anglicans were Sabbatarians. So they outlawed the sale of most goods and services on Sunday, 1762. There's not a lot of evidence that they implemented this, but this is interesting. Georgia passed a bill in 1785 that allowed tax money to be used for the support of religion. And here's their reasoning. They said that, quote, regular establishment and support, and they're referencing the Christian religion, is among the most important objects of legislature determination. So they're saying, actually, it's very important that the civil government support the Christian religion. But Georgia did, in 1798, so rather early, they did end all religious tests for office. So they had them, but they got rid of them by 1798. Okay, so that's Georgia. Let me mention South Carolina. South Carolina is interesting with its religious history. Because I did mention this before. They end up establishing Christianity generally in 1778. So I'll mention that again in a moment. So South Carolina in 1712 they passed a Sabbath law, and that remained in effect till 1880. So they had a Sabbath law from 1712 to 1880. But even after disestablishment, the Anglican Church was still pretty powerful in South Carolina. And part of that, and that's even true into the 19th century, in large part because the church owned the glebs and other property since the early 18th century. So they had a lot of land they got basically from the state. And so even with this, and this happened in other places too, but especially in South Carolina, even with the Church of England losing its power, it's no longer an established church in the state of South Carolina, you still had a lot of land that belonged to the Church of England. But Low Country planters, they did include religious dissenters, such as Presbyterians, in their revolutionary councils because they wanted to keep their support during the war, or for the war. So, they couldn't be too strongly anti-dissenter. So the Anglicans had to work with them. In fact, this is interesting. 1775, South Carolina's Colonial Assembly, they sent William Henry Drayton and then Presbyterian minister William Tennant Jr. They sent them into the backcountry not to make converts, but to recruit dissenters to the American cause. So they're like, hey, William Tennant Jr., can you go into the backcountry? You're a Presbyterian, and get these guys to fight for us, right, in the war. So that's what they were doing. And after the war, South Carolina's second constitution, this is 1778, they gave equal legal standing to all Protestants. And actually, that William Tennant is credited with persuading the assembly to replace the Anglican establishment with a general Protestant establishment. So this is 1778. It doesn't last too long, but it does last 12 years. So you have this general establishment. Now, I mentioned this when we talked about Virginia. They almost did this. Patrick Henry supported a general establishment in Virginia, and it was very close to passing. And then, because of Madison, James Madison, some other influence, it did not pass. And then the Presbyterians initially in Virginia wanted the general establishment, and then they reversed course and they just wanted no establishment. So they backed Jefferson and Madison. But here in South Carolina, they did get this passed, 1778 to 1790, and William Tennant is credited with influencing this. So what this did is it established, quote, the Christian Protestant religion. So it's a general Protestant establishment. So instead of just Anglicanism, it's all Protestants are established as the official religion. It required office holders to affirm 5 articles of doctrine. And I mentioned some of these before, but that included, I think, even like the affirming not only belief in God, but the Trinity and Scripture and things like this. So it was Protestant. And yet, as I noted, even with this, Anglicanism still maintained prominence in public functions. Their disestablishment was moderated because Anglican churches retained the right of incorporation, and they also had vested property. So South Carolina is weird in that they have this general establishment but still have kind of Anglican prominence after at that point. Okay, so it's pretty interesting stuff that you have this general establishment. Okay, any thoughts or questions on any of that? I've got another thing I want to cover here before we end, which is, we'll at least start, is the universities. Presbyterians in the universities in these 3 states, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. I've made this point before, and I think it's just clear when you talk about it, but Presbyterians were just massively influential on the educational institutions in America, but especially in the middle colonies and the South. So they established the College of New Jersey. They're also establishing seminaries, so Princeton Seminary in 1812. But in the South, they established all sorts of universities. In fact, by 1861, so by the start of the Civil War, there were 66 permanent colleges in the South. 66 permanent colleges in the South. 17 of those had been founded by Presbyterians. So it's pretty significant. 11 by Baptists, 9 by Methodists. You did have some private colleges. We've talked about some of these before in Virginia. Washington and Lee, which was initially Liberty Hall, and then Washington College because it was given land by George Washington. And then Robert E. Lee was president after the Civil War, and so they changed the name to Washington Lee. Of course, it's still there. Hampton-Sydney College, also in Virginia. Davidson College, which I'll maybe mention in a little bit, 1838, they're founded in North Carolina, and that's a Presbyterian institution. It's private. So you have the private schools, private colleges, but you also have state institutions. Let me list some of these. These are in the South. You have Transylvania University, which I think that's Kentucky. That was originally Transylvania Seminary. University of Georgia was founded by Presbyterians in 1785. It was originally called Franklin College. The University of University of North Carolina, 1789, and the University of Tennessee, which was originally Blount College, 1794. But Presbyterians also really dominated the College of South Carolina, which I'll mention. So in all three of those states then, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Presbyterians dominated their educational institutions. So this shows, even when they weren't like always the majority, the Presbyterians were always prominent and influential in education. Let me talk a little bit about the University of North Carolina. North Carolina's colonial legislature approved an act in 1771 that established Queen's College in Charlotte, but then the British Crown annulled the act because the majority of the trustees were Presbyterians. So Presbyterians got involved, and then they're like, all right, no, forget about that. But then after North Carolina ratified the Constitution, the state's General Assembly granted a charter in December of 1789 for a state college that opened in 1795, and this is the University of North Carolina. So even though it didn't open then, it was 1789, UNC. Most people today probably don't think of UNC as a Presbyterian institution, but early on it was. So this is interesting. The major figures in the early days, there was Reverend Samuel E. McCorkle and Major William R. Davie. Davie was actually a rationalist, so more like a Jeffersonian type. He favored a curriculum dominated by science. Okay, science is good. Actually, a lot of the Christians liked science and were teaching science, but you can kind of see some of this goes way back, right? Even a couple hundred years ago, where they only want science. They want to gut all the other stuff, the liberal arts and certainly theology. But you have a man named Joseph Caldwell, who was a graduate of the College of New Jersey, Princeton. So he went to a Presbyterian school, and he came to the university as a professor of mathematics in 1796. So another Caldwell. But Joseph, I don't know if there's any relation. Joseph Caldwell. 1773 to 1835 was his years. So he was a professor of mathematics. He helped Reverend Samuel E. McCorkle and his allies to overcome the rationalist William Davie and to ensure that the university was theologically orthodox and also adhered to a classical curriculum, right? So Greek, Latin, and all of the classics. At this point, rationalist and Roman Catholic professors resigned. So they said, well, we lost. They resigned. And then Joseph Caldwell is elected the first president in 1804. So he's a reverend. He's reverend. I mean, this is just back in the day. He's a mathematics professor, but he's also a pastor. He retained this position, the presidency, until his death in 1835, with an exception of 4 years where he resumed his chair of mathematics. This is wild. Prior to 1861, so prior to the Civil War, every president and even every acting president of the University of North Carolina was Presbyterian. So from Joseph Caldwell all the way to the Civil War, Presbyterian presidents of the college. Now, just one thought here is sometimes we say, we might think, and this gets into, how is Christianity supposed to relate to the universities? They should just, so there's one argument that everything should just be private. That's generally what I favor. We should just do private things. But actually, early on, they didn't think this way. And part of the reason is they were able to control things, and they were able to get, money for the college from the state, and they were able to have a religious university, a religious state university. And when you do that, I mean, it's hard to oppose it. I'm not even really critical of what they did, because when you think about it, it's not like, the public universities just went atheistic and secular, and the private ones didn't. No, actually, we lost all the private ones too. So it wasn't just it wasn't a public versus private institution thing. We also, Davidson College, which I mentioned, also went liberal because the church went liberal. Hampton-Sydney is independent. Washington and Lee is independent as well, but I'm not too familiar with them today, but they don't seem super conservative or religious. But I just make that point is it didn't matter whether it was public or private. Everything, given enough time in America, went secular. Let me mention the College of South Carolina. Today it's the University of South Carolina. College of South Carolina was established in Columbia in 1801. The Presbyterians didn't have their own college in South Carolina, so they just threw their support behind the College of South Carolina. Thomas Cooper, who was a rationalist, he had been run out of the University of Virginia. I mentioned this before. He was hired at the University of Virginia. Jefferson liked him a lot, but the Presbyterians, including John Holt Rice, ran him out of there. Right? They criticized him, and he took off. Jefferson was not very happy, and he blamed the Presbyterians, of course. But then, so Cooper then goes to South Carolina. He becomes the second president of the College of South Carolina in 1820. So he did hold this position for 14 years, but here's the thing to note. By 1834, he resigned both his presidency and his professorship due to religious opposition by the Presbyterians and the Charleston Observer, which was run by Presbyterians. So they just kept blasting him, and he was an infidel. He denied Mosaic authorship of the Bible, the Pentateuch, and all sorts of things. He wasn't an Orthodox Christian. And then as part of the college's reorganization, Episcopalian minister Stephen Elliott becomes chaplain. He's appointed the professor of a new chair, the Evidences of Christianity and Sacred Literature. So this is at a public institution. And then he later resigns or leaves, and then who fills his spot but James Henley Thornwell, right? One of the leading Presbyterian theologians in the South. He was professor of metaphysics and then chaplain, and then Thornwell later becomes president of the college. But then he also goes to Columbia Seminary, so he's kind of all over the place. I'll mention Franklin College next time, and maybe which is also interesting because their fifth president was Moses Waddell, and he was a massively influential Presbyterian there, including he trained John C. Calhoun at one of his academies. So I think it's pretty obvious. Tons of Presbyterian influence in the Carolinas and also Georgia, but especially the Carolinas. So, okay, well let's end there. Unless anyone had a quick question or thought or anything. Okay. Hopefully you didn't know much of this. I mean, it's not really talked about a lot, but I think it's fascinating, especially if you're Presbyterian. Okay, let's pray. Father, we do praise you for your work in history, even in the early colonies of America, including the South, and also Presbyterians establishing educational institutions. We pray that you just give us grateful hearts and grow us in our knowledge of American history, but also may these things just help us as we think about today and the future. So bless us now as we prepare for worship. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
Would a lot of these men, would their lives exhibit fruit of the Spirit and, truly new creations, or were they power brokers like everybody else?
No, I think back then a lot of these guys were like godly, like Caldwell. I mean, a lot of these guys were ministers. I think these guys were like the real deal. The Caldwells.
Real godliness in them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and Thornwell was very godly. Yeah, so, and he was the president after Cooper. So. I don't. These weren't just nominal. These weren't just nominal Christians. Yeah.
It seems like it's so hard nowadays that if you wear your Christianity, if it's exhibited in your life, you're sort of. You can't play ball.
Yeah. Here, I'll help you get this. Yeah, it's a different. It's a different world. I mean, they obviously had rationalism and the like.
Oh yeah.
Is it easier just for you to get it? Is that what okay.
You open that door.
Yeah, let's do that. Is it both of them? Oh, there we go. There we go. And just pop them?
There we go.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, you definitely had the rationalism back then. I mean, we see that, but the Jeffersonian stuff. But you had a battle between it, and what's fascinating. Yes, but it also kind of got. I mean, I've raised this before. How it kind of got driven out of the South. At least Unitarianism did not survive in the South. So. I mean, I don't know entirely. It's hard to explain entirely, though. I do think the Presbyterians played a big part. Here's what it is: you had Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists. You had a lot of revivalism in the South, whereas in the North, you had more. Hey, Randy, you had more established congregationalism, and they were just going liberal and secular, and you just didn't. It just some of it just played out differently. And then I think the Civil War